Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. What I'm going to speak to was really part of a presentation that was done at the National Metropolis Conference in Ottawa a little earlier this month. And Hindia was chairing that meeting, and she asked if I might come and present to the group, and of course I was thrilled to do so. It is based, and maybe you can just switch to the next slide, please. Based on collaborative work from the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities project, which is a SSHRC-funded project that is led by Valerie Preston from York University. And the focus of this work is very much on advocacy, and it's the various dimensions of advocacy and how this connects to resilience and the future of immigrant settlement and integration and the overall well-being of newcomers. And the overall point I'm trying to make in this short presentation is about the importance of advocacy and the need to recenter it as a priority. I was very happy to hear Councillor King's presentation, because I think it speaks to the very importance of the advocacy role. If we are to build back better, and that was the promise, of course, of the post-pandemic world, then the advocacy role of settlement sector organizations needs to continue to be active, in fact, greatly enhanced. And the sector's capacity in this area is going to have to be strengthened, and that should also be reflected in the funding models of the sector. Next slide, please. So what is advocacy? Well, broadly, it's the act of voicing the concerns and needs of the constituency, conveying their opinion and representing their interests to the state. Now, nonprofit organizations like immigrant settlement agencies have two key roles, that is service and advocacy. And in fact, these two roles really do go together. They are, or they should be, organically linked. Advocacy, I think it's really important to note, is also good service. To properly provide for the needs of clients and communities, we need to hear their voices so that we can understand what their needs really are, and so that communities themselves can articulate their own interests and therefore work for their well-being. Next slide, please. Now, a major problem has been the impact of neoliberalism and associated measures such as austerity, and for the nonprofit sector, the role of new public management, which began in the 1980s. And, the effects of neoliberalism has worked to marketize nonprofit work. It's attempted to make agencies pure service providers under contract, and to delegitimate, at least to a large degree, the advocacy role of nonprofit organizations. Now, advocacy, of course, didn't disappear under neoliberalism, but it's been turned into something to borrow a phrase from Bauman, into kind of liquid advocacy. Advocacy loses some of its solid form, in other words, where nonprofits must be flexible in how they engage in advocacy, and it becomes much more intermittent, hybrid, and masked in its forms, and so that it can escape the displeasure of government funders. And that leads to contradictory tendencies because of the problem of advocacy chill. On the one hand, organizations are highly incentivized to refrain and downplay advocacy. On the other hand, because the clients they serve are further marginalized, other organizations are compelled to become even more active around advocacy. But this tension often results in a fragmented response among nonprofit providers. Coordinating, planning, and strategizing among nonprofits as a whole consequently becomes quite difficult. And this has been a truly difficult terrain in which to engage in advocacy for the sector. Next slide, please. Now, given its history, it's not surprising that advocacy remains an issue of some sensitivity, and differing approaches to it exist within the settlement sector. In fact, some prefer not to talk about advocacy at all, but to talk in the language of community engagement. Regardless of what their sensitivity around advocacy, of course, everybody is interested with hearing the voices of those that they serve. Now, there's also, I think we need to point out types of advocacy. And the first point I guess I would make here is that there are different players in this system. Immigrant settlement agencies, of course, but they often have capacity issues. There's the LIPs, which play a really important coordinating and informational roles, and umbrella organizations like Advocacy, which often engage in more direct forms of advocacy. And so each of them do tend to play different roles within this. Local immigrant partnerships, that's the LIPs. The second is that advocacy comes in different forms. And I would say, generally speaking, we can talk about this from hard advocacy to softer forms of advocacy. And hard advocacy involves directly lobbying government, engaging in public criticism, and challenging on a frontal level sort of government policy. Soft advocacy, by contrast, is about engaging with funders and policymakers, but mostly behind the scene, with regular communication, informing, educating officials around client issues and concerns. And the focus here is often on consultation and consensus building. Next slide. Advocacy in the nonprofit sector is, of course, about relationships and engagement between the state and nonprofits. And this inevitably leads to both collaboration as well as conflict. The effectiveness of softer forms of advocacy, of course, rest on the willingness of government officials and funders to listen and engage as co-producers in services and respect the voices and perspectives of agencies and often act upon those perspectives. Of course, neoliberalism engaged with nonprofits, but as contracted alternative service delivery agencies, not as true partners with voice. And this has been termed, I think appropriately, as antagonistic collaboration. Next slide. The key development during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada is that the IRCC relationship with ISAs and the broader settlement sector shifted with the move away from sort of new public management, neoliberal kinds of approaches to, I think, one of a truer partnership based upon listening, regular communication, respectful relationships, rule relaxation to enhance flexibility, and strong government support for the sector, including funding support. This is the context in which soft advocacy is effective at building cooperative partnerships where voice is heard and acted upon. And I think this was a very significant development. The pandemic, in fact, opened up a policy window, creating space for alternative visions of policy, including for the immigrant settlement sector. And the hegemony of neoliberal approaches was challenged, and the prospect of building back better along more inclusive lines became a possibility. The pandemic is a great revealer and a reshaper of relationships. Next slide. The concern is that this lesson of the pandemic may not survive the recovery, and there will be a return to past practice and a more one-sided competitive funding relationship where voice is muted and where that policy window shuts. Let me just say a few words then about resilience and advocacy. It is the social justice missions, including the voice-oriented components of this mission, that drive nonprofit organizations to be innovative and resilient. This is primarily not the neoliberal idea of resilience, which rests upon individual notions of the ability to resiliently endure, and for ISAs to do more with less. Now, ISAs are great at doing more with less, but that is capacity draining, and that is also not sustainable in the long run. So we need to move beyond that form of resilience. Next slide. Resilience is not just a reactive capacity, but it can also be proactive with possibilities for collective transformation. Hence, resilience is not just about bouncing back, but about the possibilities of bounding forward. And I think this speaks to progressive forms of resilience rooted in the idea of social resilience and transformative resilience. As part of the settlement sector advocacy is the need not just to advocate, of course, for immigrant communities, but to promote self-advocacy by clients and cause advocacy directed at policy change, promoting transformational shifts. Next slide. In this process, immigrants and their communities are empowered and enabled with the capacity to amplify their voices and exercise influence over their own destinies. For nonprofit organizations, consequently, their advocacy role is not only to speak on behalf of their clients, but to aid in the empowerment of immigrants as citizens with collective voice. And this is key to achieving social justice and building back better and promoting newcomer well-being. As community leaders in the sector have also noted, it's not just enough to advocate directed at government at all three levels of government, but also we have to reach further into society. Next slide. I won't. That's the final slide.
Got one more minute, so
yeah, I won't read the slide. You can read it yourself. It's from a nonprofit organization, but basically they're saying we need to move beyond three levels of government and to also advocate within civil society itself and also within the private sector. And let me leave it at that, and we can turn it over to our next speaker.
brilliant. Thank you, Professor Shields.